It did not begin with a speech. It did not begin with a fight. It began with a missing name. Somewhere between one palace draft and the next, Meghan Markle's name was gone from a royal guest list. No note. No public correction. No warm explanation added later to soften the sting. Just a quiet deletion inside a system where every name means something. And in royal life, absence can say more than scandal ever could. That is what made this moment feel so sharp. Today we are diving into what many people believe was not just a social change, but a message. A very careful one. The kind of message the royal family often sends without saying a word. No shouting. No dramatic scene on palace steps. Just paperwork, silence, and the slow understanding that a line had been drawn. On paper, a guest list sounds small. Boring even. But royal watchers know better. A guest list inside palace walls is not just a list of people coming to an event. It is a map. It shows who matters, who belongs, who is trusted, who is welcome, and who is being kept at a distance. Each name is weighed. Each absence is noticed. That is why this story spread so fast among commentators, insiders, and the people who follow the royal family like a second language. Because this was not only about a seat at an event. It was about standing. Reports suggest that, at one point, Meghan's name had been included. Quietly. Carefully. Not announced, not celebrated, but present. That detail matters. If true, it meant there had been at least some room left open, however small, for a sign of connection. A thin thread. A fragile one maybe, but still there. Then the thread was cut. And it was cut so neatly that some people inside the system were said to be stunned by how final it looked. Accounts from palace reporters and royal insiders describe a strange kind of confusion in the hours that followed. Senior aides had seen one version. Then they saw another. The difference was not huge in size, but massive in meaning. A name once there was no longer there. The updated document came with no appetite for debate. No visible trail of argument. No public-facing effort to explain what changed. Just a final version. That silence mattered almost as much as the deletion itself. Because if this had been a simple clerical issue, there would have been language around it. There usually is. A soft phrase. A polite adjustment. A line that allows everyone to save face. But what made people pause here was the clean, almost clinical feel of it. No smoothing over. No comforting words. No little patch placed over the crack. That is when whispers started moving through royal circles. Not loud whispers. The careful kind. The kind that begin with, "This did not come from nowhere." And then, very quickly, attention turned in one direction. Prince William. Not necessarily as someone sitting in a room making a dramatic declaration. Not in that simple way. But as the figure many believed had become too central, too powerful, and too decisive for this kind of move to happen without his agreement. More and more, people had already begun describing him as a man tightening the shape of the monarchy around him. Firmer boundaries. Clearer roles. Less mess. Less room for uncertainty. This moment seemed to fit that picture. What many people don't know is that royal decisions often look coldest when they have been discussed the longest. That is what gave this story its weight. Outside the palace, the reaction was just as strange. There was no immediate thunder from the Sussex side. No quick denial. No dramatic correction. No burst of public anger that might have turned this into open war within hours. And that silence became part of the story too. Because when something like this happens, people expect noise. Instead, there was quiet. A heavy quiet. And some observers took that to mean the moment had not come as a surprise at all. They began connecting it to months of distance, months of carefully managed separation, months of public appearances that looked fine on the surface but felt cooler underneath. The kind of distance you can miss if you only watch headlines, but not if you watch patterns. That is where this story starts getting bigger. Because once people began looking backward, the deletions stopped looking random. It started looking like the latest move in a slow change that had already been happening for a long time. One event here, one absence there, one role reduced, one invitation narrowed. None of it dramatic on its own. But together, they told a story. And it was not a happy one. There was a time when even a complicated appearance by Meghan at a royal event might have been read as a sign that the family still had some bridge left to cross. Not a healed wound, not a loving reunion, but a bridge. Something symbolic. Something useful in a monarchy that lives on symbols almost as much as bloodlines. That is why the removal hit so hard. It turned what could have been read as quiet reconciliation into something else entirely. Something more definite. More controlled. More final. This was not just about who attended a formal gathering. It was about who stood inside the royal frame and who stood outside it. And once people saw it that way, the whole thing changed shape. A guest list became a power story. A missing name became a signal. A quiet edit became a public message without words. And the most unsettling part was not that it happened. It was how smoothly it happened. No mess. No scene. No apology. Just a decision that seemed to appear fully formed, as if debate had already ended before most people realized it had begun. But there was more under the surface than one deleted name. Because to understand why that absence mattered, you have to go back to the relationship behind it. Back before the paperwork. Back before the silence became strategy. Back to the years when this fracture was still personal, still emotional, and not yet fully built into the structure of the monarchy itself. That is where the deeper story begins. Long before a guest list changed, something inside this family had already shifted. At first, the distance between Prince William and Prince Harry looked like the kind families often go through. Two brothers growing older. Two men carrying different duties. Two lives moving in different directions. People wanted to believe it was temporary, or at least manageable. Royal insiders remember when the bond between them was still part of the monarchy's emotional story. Shared grief. Shared duty. Shared history. They had once seemed to understand each other in a way few others could. That is why the later distance felt so personal to so many people watching. Because it was not just about protocol. It was about memory. The brothers had been shaped by the same loss, the same spotlight, the same strange life of being watched from childhood. For years, that shared experience gave the public a simple image. Whatever their differences, they had each other. It was an image the monarchy benefited from. It felt human. It felt steady. It felt real. Then life changed. Harry's marriage to Meghan brought a new rhythm, a new energy, and for many people, a new kind of tension. To some, Meghan looked like fresh air entering an old institution. To others, she looked like disruption arriving at the front gate. Those two views never stopped competing. And once they took hold, nearly every public moment involving her was read through one of those lenses. Inside the palace, according to journalists who followed the family closely, the issue was less about image and more about consequence. New people change old systems. Sometimes gently. Sometimes not. And when the system is the monarchy, even small changes can feel huge to the people trying to protect it. That is when the first warning signs began to matter. Not one giant explosion. A series of smaller ones. An interview that raised eyebrows. A public statement that felt too personal. A memoir that opened private doors and let the world look inside. Each moment had its own headline. Each one could be discussed on its own. But inside royal circles, people were not only looking at single moments. They were looking at accumulation. And that changes everything. What looked like family pain in public was, inside palace thinking, starting to look like institutional risk. That is a very different category. Once trust becomes the issue, emotions stop being the only thing in the room. Strategy enters. Caution enters. Distance stops being personal and starts becoming policy. That is the point many commentators believe this story eventually reached. There were signs. Invitations became more selective. Appearances became rarer. Access looked less automatic. Security, once seen by some as expected, became a point of dispute, then limitation, then something harder and more official. Roles that once carried symbolic warmth began to feel cooler. Titles stayed, but the meaning around them seemed to shift. The center of the monarchy looked narrower. At first, these things could be explained away. People did explain them away. Every family is complicated. Every institution has rules. Every event has limits. All true. But there comes a point when separate explanations stop feeling separate. They begin to form a pattern. And once people saw the pattern here, it became hard to unsee. Royal commentators started using careful language. They did not always say, "cut off." They said things like, "streamlining, clarity, a leaner monarchy," and "clearer roles." Official-sounding phrases. Clean phrases. Respectable phrases. But underneath them sat a harder idea. Somebody was deciding who belonged at the center, and who no longer did. That is where Prince William's role started to attract more attention. For years, he had been seen as the future of the monarchy in a broad, almost abstract way. But slowly, accounts from journalists and insiders began painting a more active picture. Not just a prince waiting his turn. A man already shaping the atmosphere around him. Less willing to leave gray areas. Less willing to let confusion sit. More interested in structure than sentiment. That style matters in a royal setting. Because the monarchy survives by making the unclear look clear. And if William was moving toward a stronger gatekeeping role, then every decision around access, appearances, and inclusion would begin to reflect that. Not dramatically at first. Quietly. Through the kind of palace choices most people would miss unless they were watching closely. Then came another layer: timing. King Charles III's health concerns added pressure to an institution already under strain. In uncertain times, symbols matter even more. So does discipline. So does the image of control. A monarchy that looks shaky invites questions. A monarchy that looks united buys time. But if true unity is not available, then institutions often choose something else: controlled order. That may be the key to understanding what happened. Because from that angle, the story stops being just about hurt feelings between family members. It becomes about what the monarchy thinks it needs in order to survive the next chapter. And survival logic can be very different from family logic. Many people outside that world still hoped for some form of repair. A quiet reunion. A symbolic appearance. A shared event that would cool the public heat and show that the bridge, though damaged, had not collapsed. Even a small gesture would have mattered. That is what made the missing name so striking later on. It did not just block attendance. It seemed to answer the question of whether there was still room for that symbolic bridge. And the answer, at least in that moment, appeared to be no. The warning signs had been there. People just did not all read them the same way at the time. Some saw modernization. Some saw discipline. Some saw emotional fallout. Some saw a power shift. Maybe it was all of those things at once. But then came the moment when those quiet signs turned visible. Not loud. Visible. A palace event meant to reflect stability. A guest list meant to show alignment. A space where every presence had meaning and every absence could not help but speak. On that particular occasion, what had been building in hints and patterns seemed to harden into something undeniable. And that is when the private fracture started looking like public structure. On this particular occasion, the event itself was supposed to say something reassuring. That matters. It was not just another royal date on a calendar. It had been framed, at least in insider circles, as one of those carefully balanced moments where tradition, diplomacy, visibility, and charitable influence could all stand together in one polished royal picture. The kind of event that tells the public, without saying it directly, that the institution is still steady, still functioning, still united enough to perform unity. That was the plan. Then the guest list became the story. Imagine the mood inside Kensington Palace as updated documents moved from one hand to another. Nothing explosive on the surface. No shouting in corridors. No dramatic confrontation. Just paperwork. But people who work around power know when paper becomes power. And this was one of those times. Aides who had seen earlier versions reportedly found themselves staring at a revised list that no longer matched what had been circulating before. Meghan's name, once included, was gone. Not marked out with visible drama. Not left there as a question. Gone in a way that suggested the question had already been settled elsewhere. And quickly. That quickness is important. Because palace systems are built to manage sensitivity. If a change needs padding, it gets padding. If a conflict needs softer edges, someone usually provides them. But according to the narrative that spread afterward, this did not come wrapped in comforting language. Instructions were said to be firm. No visible revisions. No open debate. No explanation offered for wider consumption. The list, as it stood now, was final. That one idea carried enormous force. Once finality enters a royal story, the mood changes. People stop asking if something happened by mistake and start asking what message is being sent. And almost immediately, the talk turned toward authority. Who had the power to make a move like this? Who benefited from making the lines clearer? Who was no longer interested in leaving the door half open? The answer many observers circled back to was William. Not always in blunt language, but in steady implication. By then, his public image had already begun shifting. Less the approachable air in preparation. More the future king already exercising control. Accounts from journalists and palace watchers described him as increasingly decisive, increasingly focused on stability, and increasingly unwilling to let unresolved tensions blur the shape of the monarchy. In that context, the deletion made sense to people who had been tracking the pattern. It fit. Outside the palace, the fallout started almost immediately. Media outlets picked up the story not because there had been a fiery official statement, but because there had not been one. Silence became oxygen. Every missing explanation created more room for interpretation. Every hour without clarification made the absence feel more intentional. Some commentators framed it as necessary structure. They argued that the monarchy had been moving toward a leaner center for some time, and that this was simply another visible step. If only working royals were to remain fully inside the institutional frame, then symbolic lines had to become real ones eventually. Others saw something colder. To them, the removal was not just administrative. It was personal history transformed into formal exclusion. It was an old wound being managed through modern palace control. It was family pain hardened into policy. That split in public interpretation only made the whole thing bigger. And then came the Sussex silence. No immediate public blowback. No quick reshaping of the narrative. No dramatic push to challenge the suggestion that Meghan had been removed. For many people, that silence felt telling. It suggested this was not a surprise thunderbolt from a clear sky. It suggested a history behind the moment, maybe even an expectation. Because if a bridge has already been collapsing for years, you do not gasp the same way when another piece falls. Still, the emotional impact was strong. Supporters of Meghan and Harry saw symbolism in everything. To them, this was not only about one event. It was about belonging. It was about how institutions close ranks. It was about who gets described as disruptive and who gets to define order. Social media exploded with arguments about fairness, power, race, tradition, modernity, and the way royal silence can often deepen pain rather than contain it. Meanwhile, defenders of the monarchy saw a different picture. They argued that the institution had the right to define its working core, especially in a time of health worries, public scrutiny, and constant pressure. From that view, clarity was not cruelty. It was necessity. And there, right in the middle of those two reactions, sat the real crisis. Because the monarchy was no longer being asked whether it could hide its internal divisions. It was being asked whether those divisions had already become its structure. That is a much harder question. The event that was meant to project unity ended up exposing the opposite. Not through open conflict, but through calibrated exclusion. Not through speeches, but through absence. Royal stories often work that way. Their loudest moments are sometimes the quietest to look at. No one needed to say, "This is a boundary." The boundary was already visible. The world could see it in what was missing. And once that happened, the story could no longer be pulled back into the smaller language of logistics. It had grown too large for that. Commentators started asking bigger questions. Was this temporary? Was it strategic? Was it the future shape of the royal family becoming visible in real time? Had William effectively become the gatekeeper of a tighter, more controlled institution? People wanted answers. But the palace did what it often does best when a message is meant to stand. It did not explain itself. That silence did not calm the story. It deepened it. Because when words are withheld in a system built on symbolism, people look harder at actions. And the action here looked unmistakable. A name once present had been removed. A possibility once lingering had been narrowed. A family drama long discussed in emotional terms had suddenly been expressed in administrative form. The full truth, or at least the fullest version the outside world could reach, was still forming. But one thing was already clear. This was no longer about one invitation. It was about control. The more people looked at the story, the less it felt like a one-off decision. It felt like the clearest expression yet of something that had been building for months, maybe years, a monarchy drawing its lines with less hesitation. Not by making grand speeches about exclusion, but by shaping events so that exclusion became visible without needing a label. That is the truth many palace watchers arrived at. Not a truth written in an official statement. A truth built from pattern. Accounts from journalists, commentators, and society insiders all pointed in the same broad direction. The monarchy was moving toward a smaller, tighter center. Fewer people fully inside. Clearer distinctions between working and non-working royals. Less tolerance for blurred identities. Less space for symbolic half-belonging. Within that structure, Meghan and Harry's position looked increasingly fixed. Not loudly condemned. Just defined. That may be what made the whole thing hit harder than a public argument would have. Public fights can cool. Statements can be walked back. Angry words can be blamed on emotion. But quiet structural choices feel different. They settle. They harden. They suggest planning. They suggest permanence. And this choice, to many observers, looked planned. It also revealed something about William's evolving role. For a long time, conversations about his future were just that, future tense. One day he will lead. One day he will shape the institution. One day he will set the tone. But moments like this made that, one day, feel much closer, maybe even present. The future king was no longer only preparing for authority. He was using it. That perception matters. Because monarchy is not only built on titles. It is built on visible confidence. The public must be able to sense where power sits, even when no one points at it directly. And in the eyes of many observers, this episode placed William in exactly that role, not a passive figure waiting for events to happen around him, but an active force helping decide the boundaries of royal life. That is where the personal and institutional stories meet. Was this about family hurt? Almost certainly, at least in part. Years of public disclosures, interviews, memoirs, and mutual disappointment do not disappear just because everyone uses formal language. Trust, once broken, changes the shape of every future interaction. In families, that leads to distance. In monarchies, distance can become policy. Was this also about survival? Many people think so. The royal family has been under pressure from every direction. Health concerns at the top, endless media scrutiny, debates over relevance, and the challenge of looking modern without losing mystique. In that climate, ambiguity can feel dangerous. A system under strain often tightens itself. It simplifies. It narrows. It chooses who stands at the center and who stands beyond the rope. That seems to be what this moment showed. Public reaction only proved how loaded the symbolism was. Around the world, people read the deletion through their own beliefs about the monarchy. Supporters of Harry and Meghan saw rejection, exclusion, and a cold unwillingness to heal. Others saw discipline, structure, and a monarchy finally acting like an institution instead of a wounded family. Both readings carried force because the moment itself carried force. And because the palace offered no real counterstory, the action had to speak for itself. That is when comparisons started appearing. Not exact comparisons, because royal history rarely repeats in neat shapes, but echoes. Other moments when silence masked something bigger. Other moments when a formal decision revealed a private fracture. Other moments when what looked small on the page turned out to be huge in meaning. This story entered that category. It became one of those royal moments where the details are simple but the implication is enormous. A name removed. A door closed a little more clearly. A power center revealing itself not by shouting, but by deciding. And the aftermath is bigger than one event. Because once a line is drawn that clearly, future moments are read through it. Every invitation will now mean more. Every absence will feel heavier. Every public appearance involving the wider family will be scanned for signs of who is in favor, who is tolerated, who is out, and who is never fully coming back inside. That is the real consequence of moments like this. They do not just reflect the present. They train the future. The monarchy, as many people now see it, is not trying to bring everyone back under one roof. It is trying to define which rooms matter. That is a colder project, but maybe a more realistic one from an institutional point of view. The language used around it may be polite, modernization, clarity, structure, streamlining, but the lived effect is still exclusion. And exclusion always tells a story. In this case, the story seems to be that unity no longer means including everyone who once stood in the family picture. It means keeping the core stable, even if that stability comes from controlled distance rather than emotional repair. That is not the fairy tale version of monarchy. It is the managerial version. The survival version. Some people will see that as strength. Others will see it as sadness. Maybe it is both. Because beneath all the protocol and symbolism, there is still a family inside this story. Two brothers who once seemed unbreakable. A new wife who changed the shape of an old institution whether people welcomed that change or feared it. A future king who appears increasingly willing to choose order over ambiguity. A monarchy trying to keep itself upright while the world studies every crack. That is why the guest list mattered so much. Not because of stationery. Not because of etiquette. Because it turned years of tension into something visible in black and white. A line once blurred looked sharp. A relationship once described as troubled looked structurally separated. And a future long discussed in theory looked suddenly present in practice. The palace did not need to explain the decision for people to understand its force. In fact, an explanation might have weakened it. Silence let the message land. And that message, as many people heard it, was simple: the monarchy has chosen clarity over comfort. Whether that clarity brings long-term stability or deeper division is another question. One the public will keep asking every time another event comes and another name does, or does not, appear. But for now, the shape of the story feels hard to deny. A name vanished. No announcement followed. No correction came. And in that quiet, the royal family may have said more than it ever could have said out loud. These stories provide insight into something bigger than celebrity or gossip. They show how power really works when it wants to look calm. They show how institutions protect themselves. And they show how, sometimes, the strongest message in the room is the one delivered without a single word.